February 25, 1991. Just after midnight. Main battery plotting room, USS Missouri, BB-63, 17 nautical miles off the coast of Kuwait. The air inside the fire control center tasted of steel and electricity. Chief Fire Controlman Michael Genero sat at his console, monitoring the data streams from the battleship's massive 16-inch guns. For the past hour, Missouri had been hurling 900-pound shells into Iraqi positions along the Kuwaiti coast, each round creating a crater the size of a house. The deck trembled with each salvo. The smell of cordite drifted down from the turrets above. What the Iraqi commanders watching the spectacle did not know was that they were witnessing theater, a performance staged with 60,000 tons of warship and 1 million pounds of ordnance, a show designed to make them commit a fatal mistake. The intercom crackled. Missile inbound. The voice was calm, almost conversational, but every man in the plotting room understood what it meant. Somewhere on the Kuwaiti coast, an Iraqi battery had just fired a Silkworm anti-ship cruise missile, a weapon designed to kill carriers, a weapon that could punch through the hull of any modern warship in the Gulf. Missile inbound. Brace for shock. Genero pulled on his anti-flash hood. Around him, sailors donned their gear with practiced speed. The Missouri was a Second World War veteran, recommissioned in the 1980s. Her 14-inch belt armor designed to withstand Japanese battleship shells. But this was 1991. The Silkworm carried a 100-pound warhead, not armor-piercing, but a shaped charge designed to melt through steel with a jet of superheated metal plasma. No one knew if the old armor would hold. The missile was traveling at 650 miles per hour. The British destroyer, HMS Gloucester, stationed 8 miles away, had seconds to respond. Her Type 909 fire control radar locked onto the incoming target. 2 Sea Dart missiles rippled off her launcher, white trails arcing across the black Gulf sky. In Missouri's Combat Information Center, radar operators watched 3 blips converge. The Silkworm, moving low over the water, the 2 Sea Darts, closing at Mach 2.5. Impact. The Silkworm disintegrated 15 miles from Missouri's position, the first time in naval history that a sea-launched missile had successfully intercepted another missile in combat. But the Iraqi gunners weren't done. They had achieved exactly what they wanted. They had forced the Americans to reveal their hand, to show where the invasion fleet was gathering. Within hours, Iraqi military intelligence would brief Saddam Hussein's command. The American amphibious assault was coming. The Marines would land at Ash-Shwaiba, supported by the battleships. Kuwait City would be the target. The coastal divisions must hold. Every word of that assessment was wrong. The Iraqis had no way of knowing they were looking at one of the most sophisticated deception operations in modern warfare. A phantom invasion staged with real ships, real guns, and real risk. A plan that would tie down 6 Iraqi divisions totaling 80,000 troops on the wrong coastline, while the actual coalition ground offensive swept through the western desert 150 miles away. If you genuinely value carefully researched military history told without embellishment or hype, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this is truly the kind of work you appreciate. The mystery that would haunt Iraqi commanders for years afterward was simple. How had they been so completely deceived? How had they watched thousands of tons of naval gunfire, tracked helicopter movements, monitored radio traffic, and still failed to see they were staring at a mirage? The answer lay in a calculated risk, a gambit that required the U.S. Navy to sail its most visible, most expensive warships directly into a minefield under the threat of shore-based missiles and dare the Iraqis to strike. It was the ultimate bluff, and Iraq took the bait. Chapter 2. The Fortress Kuwait Problem. August 2, 1990. Pentagon, Washington, D.C. When Iraqi armored columns rolled into Kuwait City, they triggered a crisis that would reshape American military planning for a generation. But the immediate problem facing U.S. Central Command was brutally simple. How do you remove 430,000 Iraqi troops from a heavily fortified position without suffering catastrophic casualties? The Iraqi military in August 1990 was the 4th largest army in the world. Pollock, Arabs at War. It fielded 5,500 main battle tanks, 3,000 artillery pieces, and 700 combat aircraft. More critically, it was a battle-hardened force. For 8 years, from 1980 to 1988, Iraqi units had fought Iran in a grinding war of attrition that killed an estimated 1 million people. They understood defensive warfare. They knew how to dig in, absorb punishment, and counterattack. Iraqi commanders brought lessons learned from that brutal conflict. They had witnessed the effectiveness of prepared defenses, the importance of artillery in suppressing enemy advances, and the value of armored counterattacks against forces that had overextended their supply lines. Iranian human wave attacks had been stopped cold by Iraqi defensive positions. Now those same principles would be applied to defending Kuwait. By September 1990, Iraqi engineers had transformed Kuwait into a fortress. The Saddam Line, a defensive belt running along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, consisted of sand berms 20 feet high, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire obstacles, and dense minefields containing thousands of Italian-made Valmara anti-personnel mines. U.S. Army official history: certain victory. Behind this barrier, Iraqi infantry divisions waited in prepared positions, supported by artillery and armored reserves. The defensive system followed Soviet doctrine: defense in depth with multiple layers. Forward reconnaissance positions would detect approaching forces. A first line of infantry and reinforced bunkers and trenches would slow the attack and channel it into kill zones. Artillery positioned behind the infantry would pound approaching forces. Mobile armored reserves would counterattack any breakthrough, ideally hitting enemy forces while they were disorganized and vulnerable after penetrating the first line. But Iraqi planners also recognized Kuwait's vulnerability from the sea. The coastline was indefensible in its entirety. 120 miles of beaches, islands, and shallow coastal waters that could support amphibious landings. Defending every potential landing site was impossible. Instead, Iraqi command focused on the most likely approaches: beaches near Kuwait City, the strategic islands of Failaka and Bubiyan, and the port facilities at Ash Shuaiba that could support rapid logistics buildup. Intelligence estimates reaching Baghdad suggested that an amphibious assault was not just possible, but likely. American amphibious capability was well documented. The U.S. Marine Corps had trained for decades to conduct opposed landings. The Persian Gulf's geography, shallow waters close to shore, predictable tidal patterns, relatively calm seas in winter, favored amphibious operations. Historical precedent suggested the Americans would exploit this advantage. Intelligence assessments, reaching CENTCOM Commander General H.P.Y. Norman Schwarzkopf in September, painted a grim picture. A frontal assault against these defenses would be costly. The Vietnam War had taught the American military, and the American public, to measure success not just in territory captured, but in lives preserved. Schwarzkopf needed a way to win decisively while minimizing coalition casualties. The geography of the theater suggested an obvious solution: amphibious assault. Kuwait had 120 miles of coastline on the Persian Gulf. The capital, Kuwait City, sat less than 5 miles from the sea. An amphibious landing, Marines hitting the beaches, securing a foothold, and driving inland, could bypass the Saddam Line entirely, threaten Kuwait City directly, and force the Iraqis to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. It was precisely what any competent military planner would expect. This expectation became the coalition's weapon. By October 1990, U.S. intelligence agencies were monitoring Iraqi defensive preparations along the coast. Iraqi engineers constructed beach obstacles, laid mines, and fortified buildings overlooking potential landing zones. More tellingly, Iraqi command began shifting units. The 2nd, 11th, 18th, and 19th Infantry Divisions, approximately 60,000 troops, were repositioned to defend the coast. British Joint Intelligence Committee assessments declassified 22,001. Additional mechanized units, including elements of the 5th Mechanized Division, were designated as coastal reserves. Vice Admiral Stanley Arthur, commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, understood the implications immediately. The Iraqis were committing substantial forces to defend against an amphibious assault, forces that could not simultaneously defend against a ground attack from the south and west. The question was, could the U.S. amplify that fear? Could the Navy make the threat of amphibious assault so credible, so overwhelming, that Iraqi commanders would keep their coastal divisions in place even after the real ground offensive began? The answer required solving 3 problems. First, the Navy needed to make the amphibious threat visible. Iraqi intelligence would have to see clear evidence of landing preparations: ships, equipment, personnel movements. But visibility created vulnerability. Any forces concentrated for invasion would be exposed to Iraqi counterattack. Second, the deception had to be sustainable. It wasn't enough to threaten invasion in January and abandon the plan in February. The phantom assault had to appear imminent right up until, and even during, the actual ground offensive. That meant continuous operations in hostile waters. Third, and most critically, the deception had to be believable under scrutiny. Iraq possessed sophisticated intelligence capabilities inherited from Soviet advisors. Their analysts would look for the logistic signature of a real invasion: fuel stores, medical facilities, command infrastructure. They would count ships, track flight patterns, intercept communications. The deception had to survive professional skepticism. General Schwarzkopf's solution was elegant and audacious. Don't fake the invasion. Plan it for real. Starting in September 1990, U.S. Marine Forces Central Command began developing actual operational plans for an amphibious assault on Kuwait. 11 different plans were drafted over the next 4 months. USMC official history, U.S. Marines in the Persian Gulf. Each plan was detailed, professionally staffed, and theoretically executable. Beach surveys were conducted, tide tables analyzed, helicopter flight paths calculated, medical evacuation routes planned. This wasn't theater for Iraqi intelligence. It was genuine operational planning, because for much of late 1990 and early 1991, neither Schwarzkopf nor the Marine commanders knew for certain whether the amphibious option would be needed. What changed the calculus was the air campaign. On January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began with a massive air offensive against Iraqi command, control, and communications infrastructure. Over the next 5 weeks, coalition aircraft flew more than 100,000 sorties. U.S. Air Force official statistics. They systematically destroyed Iraqi radar sites, communications nodes, bridges, ammunition depots, and supply routes. More critically, they began pounding the Iraqi army units in Kuwait, degrading their combat effectiveness through sustained bombardment. By early February, battlefield intelligence suggested that the Iraqi forces in Kuwait were far weaker than initially assessed. Many units were understrength, poorly supplied, and suffering from low morale. Desertion rates were climbing. The Republican Guard divisions, Iraq's elite forces, were still formidable, but the regular army divisions defending the Saddam line were crumbling under air attack. This created an opening for Schwarzkopf's preferred plan, a massive armored sweep through the western desert, the famous left hook that would outflank the Saddam line entirely, cut off Iraqi forces in Kuwait, and destroy the Republican Guard in open battle. But this plan only worked if the Iraqis stayed in place. If they detected the westward movement of U.S. 7 Corps and 18 Airborne Corps, more than 200,000 troops and 1,500 tanks redeploying across hundreds of miles of desert, they could reposition to counter the threat. The Republican Guard could withdraw north into Iraq, preserving Saddam's most capable units for future conflicts. The amphibious threat became the pin that would hold Iraqi forces in place. A visible, credible, terrifying demonstration that the Marines were coming from the sea. Chapter 3, the 1/6-inch solution. The weapon for this demonstration was already in theater, and it was impossible to miss. USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin, Iowa-class battleships commissioned in 1944, were among the most distinctive warships ever built. They displaced 57,000 tons, fully loaded, stretched 887 feet from bow to stern, and bristled with a main battery of 9 16-inch 50-caliber guns capable of hurling 2 700-pound armor-piercing shells 20 miles. U.S. Navy technical documentation. Each main gun weighed 239,000 pounds. The barrel alone was 66 feet long. Loading and firing required a crew of 77 men per turret, working in a carefully choreographed sequence that could deliver a full 9-gun salvo every 30 seconds when the ships were at peak efficiency. The guns were arranged in 3 turrets, 2 forward, 1 aft, each turret capable of independent targeting and elevation. The shells came in several types. High-capacity shells carried 153 pounds of explosive, designed for shore bombardment and creating massive blast damage. Armor-piercing shells sacrificed explosive yield for penetrating power. A hardened steel projectile moving at 2,500 feet per second could punch through nearly 3 feet of steel armor. During Second World War battles, Iowa-class guns had been designed to destroy Japanese Yamato-class battleships at ranges beyond 20 miles. In 1991, they were firing at bunkers and coastal positions where the target had no chance of firing back. These ships should have been museum pieces. The last Iowa-class battleship had been decommissioned in 1958. Naval warfare had moved on, toward aircraft carriers, guided missiles, and submarine warfare. The era of the battleship dueling enemy fleets with heavy guns had ended at Leyte Gulf in 1944. But in 1981, President Ronald Reagan ordered the recommissioning of the Iowa-class battleships as part of his 600-ship Navy expansion plan. Reagan Naval Policy Directive, 1981. The ships were modernized: phalanx, close-in weapon systems for missile defense, armored box launchers carrying Tomahawk cruise missiles, upgraded radar and communications equipment. The 16-inch guns remained, because despite 40 years of technological advancement, No weapon in the U.S. Navy's inventory could match their sheer psychological impact. The modernization was controversial. Critics argued the battleships were obsolete relics consuming resources better spent on modern platforms. The ships burned fuel at prodigious rates. Missouri's gas turbine engines and older boilers required constant feeding, limiting her operational range. Manning requirements were enormous, over 1,800 sailors per ship, far more than a modern Aegis cruiser. Training gunners for the 16-inch batteries required skills that had nearly vanished from the Navy. But the counterargument was compelling. Nothing else in the fleet delivered this combination of firepower, survivability, and presence. A single battleship could deliver more ordnance on target in an hour than an entire squadron of aircraft. The armor belt, 14 inches of Class A steel, could withstand punishment that would sink any modern surface combatant. And the psychological effect on both allies and adversaries was undeniable. When an Iowa-class battleship appeared on the horizon, it commanded attention. When a 16-inch gun fires, it produces a muzzle flash visible for miles. The report, a thunderous crack followed by a rolling boom, carries across water like the voice of an angry god. The shell itself travels at 2,500 feet per second, creating a sonic boom as it passes overhead. Impact creates a detonation that registers on seismographs and a crater 50 feet wide. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers damage assessment data. This was not precision warfare. This was terror. Missouri and Wisconsin arrived in the Persian Gulf in January 1991, ostensibly to provide naval gunfire support and launch Tomahawk missiles against Iraqi targets. Between January 17th and February 28th, the two battleships would fire a combined total of 1,078 rounds of 16-inch ammunition and launch 52 Tomahawk missiles. U.S. Navy official records. But their most important mission had nothing to do with destroying targets. It was about being seen. The Navy's plan for the Amphibious Deception Operation, codename not publicly disclosed but referenced in operational orders as Amphibious Demonstration, called for the battleships to conduct sustained naval gunfire missions against Iraqi coastal positions, creating the impression of pre-invasion bombardment. The goal was to replicate the pattern of D-Day in 1944, heavy naval gunfire to soften defenses, followed by amphibious assault. But there was a problem. The Kuwaiti coast was protected by one of the densest minefields in modern naval warfare. Iraqi forces had laid more than 1,200 mines in the northern Persian Gulf, starting in August 1990, U.S. Navy Mine Warfare Command post-war assessment. The mines were a mix of Soviet-era moored contact mines and sophisticated Italian-made Manta bottom influence mines. The Manta was particularly dangerous. It sat on the seabed in shallow water and detonated when it detected the magnetic signature or pressure wave of a passing ship. Against a destroyer or cruiser, a Manta strike could break the keel and sink the vessel. On February 18, 1991, this threat became reality. The amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli struck a moored mine while conducting minesweeping operations. 4 hours later, the Aegis cruiser USS Princeton hit a Manta mine. Both ships survived, but Princeton suffered severe damage, a 20-foot hole blown in her hull, 3 injured sailors, and months of repair work ahead, official U.S. Navy accident investigation reports. The mine strikes forced a brutal calculation. To make the amphibious deception credible, U.S. ships would have to operate close to the Kuwaiti coast, inside the range of Iraqi coastal defense missiles, and inside waters that were not fully swept of mines. Vice Admiral Arthur made the decision: the battleships would go in. The logic was grimly practical. Missouri and Wisconsin had armor protection that no other ships in the fleet could match. Their underwater protection system, a complex arrangement of anti-torpedo bulges, fuel tanks, and holding bulkheads, was designed to absorb torpedo hits from Second World War weapons. While not specifically designed to resist mines, the system provided far more survivability than the thin hulls of modern destroyers and cruisers. More importantly, the battleship's deep draft, they drew 37 feet of water when fully loaded, meant they would trigger bottom-influence mines at a greater distance than shallow draft vessels. The Manta mine's magnetic sensor had a limited range. A battleship might pass over a minefield and escape with damage rather than catastrophic loss. It was still an enormous risk, but it was a risk that amplified the deception. If the U.S. Navy was willing to send its most visible, most prestigious warships into the firing line, the invasion must be real. Chapter 4. The Phantom Invasion. The amphibious deception operation began in earnest on February 18, 1991, and intensified as the ground offensive approached. The U.S. had assembled a genuine amphibious capability in the Gulf, the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit and the 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade. Approximately 17,000 Marines embarked on amphibious assault ships, landing ship docks, and support vessels. USMC Official Order of Battle. These were real combat units with real equipment: M1A1 Abrams tanks, LAV-25 light armored vehicles, artillery, helicopters, and air support from AV-8B Harrier jets operating from the amphibious assault ship USS Nassau. The Marines conducted rehearsals. On February 11th, they practiced landing operations on beaches in Oman, an exercise called Sea Soldier IV. Iraqi intelligence certainly monitored these activities. The message was clear: the Marines were preparing for combat landings. On February 23rd, the night before the ground offensive began, the Navy and Marines executed the climax of the deception. USS Missouri, escorted by the frigate USS Jarrett and HMS Gloucester, moved to within 17 nautical miles of the Kuwaiti coast. Official U.S. Navy operational logs. At midnight, Missouri's 16-inch guns opened fire on Iraqi positions near the Al-Fintas area south of Kuwait City. The bombardment continued for hours, shells screaming overhead every few minutes, each impact visible as orange flashes on the horizon. Simultaneously, Marine helicopters from Medium Helicopter Squadrons 263, 365, and Heavy Helicopter Squadron 461 launched from ships offshore and flew toward the coast, conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance in preparation for a landing. USMC aviation logs. The helicopters approached Failaka Island and Bubiyan Island, two small islands off the Kuwaiti coast that had been identified in planning documents as potential preliminary objectives for an amphibious assault. The helicopters never landed. They turned back after demonstrating their presence, but the intent was clear. These were landing zone reconnaissance flights. On February 25th, the demonstration intensified. Missouri again moved close to shore and resumed bombardment. This time, the Iraqis responded. At just before 1 a.m., shore-based batteries near Al-Fintas fired two HY-2 Silkworm anti-ship missiles, Chinese-made copies of the Soviet P-15 Termit, with a range of 50 miles and a 100-pound warhead. Intelligence briefing, U.S. Navy, February 25, 1991. One missile malfunctioned and crashed into the sea. The other locked onto Missouri's radar signature and streaked toward the battleship at 650 miles per hour. HMS Gloucester's radar detected the launch immediately. Commander Philip Wilcox ordered his weapons officer to engage. Two Sea Dart surface-to-air missiles launched from Gloucester's forward magazine, accelerating to Mach 2.5. At a range of approximately 15 miles from Missouri, the Sea Darts intercepted and destroyed the Silkworm, a remarkable feat of engineering and training that marked the first successful missile-versus-missile engagement in naval combat history. British Royal Navy official after-action report. The Iraqi response was exactly what the deception planners wanted. By firing missiles at Missouri, Iraq revealed that it took the amphibious threat seriously enough to risk depleting its limited supply of Silkworm missiles. Coalition intelligence located the launch site within minutes, and U.S. Navy A-6E intruder attack jets from the carrier USS Ranger destroyed it with cluster munitions. U.S. Navy Strike Report, February 25, 1991. But more importantly, the attack confirmed that Iraqi commanders believed the invasion fleet was gathering off their coast. They were watching the right place, fixated on the wrong threat. Meanwhile, 150 miles to the west, the real invasion was underway. Chapter 5. The Left Hook. February 24, 1991. 4 in the morning, Saudi Arabian desert, 60 miles west of Kuwait. While Missouri's guns thundered offshore, U.S. 7 Corps and 18 Airborne Corps, the armored fist of Schwarzkopf's plan, crossed into Iraq in a maneuver that would be remembered as one of the most successful operational movements in modern warfare. The force was staggering. Over 200,000 troops, including the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions, the 1st Cavalry Division, the 1st Infantry Division, mechanized, the 101st Airborne Division, Air Assault, the 82nd Airborne Division, the 24th Infantry Division, mechanized, and the British 1st Armored Division. Official U.S. CENTCOM order of battle. They fielded more than 1,500 M1A1 Abrams tanks, 1,500 Bradley fighting vehicles, and hundreds of Apache attack helicopters. This was the real assault. And the Iraqis had almost no forces in position to stop it. Iraqi military intelligence had detected some of the westward movement. Satellite reconnaissance showed unusual activity in the desert, and signals intelligence picked up radio traffic suggesting repositioning. But Iraqi analysts had dismissed the significance. They believed the main attack would come either directly across the Saudi-Kuwaiti border or from the sea. The Western Desert Movement appeared to be a flanking maneuver supporting the primary assault, not the assault itself. Post-war interviews with Iraqi intelligence officers documented in U.S. Army War College studies. The amphibious threat was too credible to ignore. The battleships were real, the bombardment was real, the helicopters were real, and the consequences of guessing wrong were catastrophic. If the Iraqis pulled their coastal divisions inland to counter a desert attack, and the Marines landed anyway, Kuwait City would fall in days. So the coastal divisions stayed in place, watching the sea, while 200,000 coalition troops drove into their rear. The speed of the ground offensive stunned both sides. 7 Corps smashed through Iraqi defenses and wheeled east toward Kuwait, engaging and destroying Republican Guard units in running tank battles. The technological mismatch was devastating. American M1A1 Abrams tanks were equipped with second-generation thermal imaging sights that could detect heat signatures from enemy vehicles at ranges exceeding 3 kilometers in total darkness. Iraqi T-72 tanks relied on active infrared systems, essentially powerful invisible flashlights that illuminated targets for the gunner. But these systems had 2 fatal flaws. Range was limited to about 800 meters, and the infrared beam itself acted as a beacon, advertising the tank's position to any enemy with passive night vision equipment. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, equipped with M1A1 Abrams tanks, fought the Battle of 73 Easting on February 26, a night engagement in a sandstorm where American gunners destroyed more than 50 Iraqi tanks without suffering a single tank loss. U.S. Army Official Battle Assessment. The thermal sights allowed the Americans to see Iraqi T-72 tanks from 3 kilometers away in pitch darkness, while the Iraqis, relying on obsolete night vision equipment, never saw the enemy that killed them. Captain H.R. McMaster, commanding Eagle Troop of the 2nd ACR, later described the engagement with clinical precision. His 9 Abrams tanks encountered elements of the Iraqi Tawakalna Mechanized Division, a Republican Guard unit considered among Iraq's best. The battle was over in 23 minutes. American gunners fired their main guns from stationary positions, using laser rangefinders to measure exact distances and digital ballistic computers to calculate firing solutions. First-round hits were the norm. Iraqi tanks that returned fire shot blindly, their rounds falling short or flying wide because they couldn't see their targets. The American 120mm smoothbore gun fired depleted uranium sabot rounds, long rod penetrators that punched through the T-72's frontal armor and detonated the ammunition stored inside. When an Iraqi tank was hit, the ammunition explosion typically blew the turret off the hull, hurling it dozens of feet through the air. Crews rarely survived. 18 airborne corps drove even further west, cutting the Baghdad-Basra highway and isolating Iraqi forces in Kuwait from reinforcement or retreat. The 101st Airborne Division conducted the longest heliborne assault in history, leapfrogging more than 150 miles deep into Iraqi territory and establishing Forward Operating Base Cobra astride Iraq's main supply routes. Apache attack helicopters ranged ahead of the ground advance, destroying Iraqi armor and artillery with Hellfire missiles. The 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions attacking overland from Saudi Arabia punched through the Saddam line with surprising ease. Iraqi defensive positions that looked formidable in aerial reconnaissance photographs turned out to be undermanned and demoralized. Entire battalions surrendered after token resistance. By February 27th, Marines were entering Kuwait City. In 4 days of ground combat, coalition forces destroyed or captured over 3,300 Iraqi tanks, 2,100 armored vehicles, 2,200 artillery pieces, and took more than 80,000 prisoners. Official CENTCOM statistics March 3, 1991. Coalition combat deaths totaled 148 killed in action. U.S. was 53% West. Department of Defense casualty records. Iraqi casualties have never been precisely determined, but estimates range from 25,000 to 50,000 killed, various sources, exact numbers disputed. The speed and decisiveness of the victory created a new problem. Iraq's military was collapsing so fast that the Republican Guard might escape destruction entirely. On February 26 and 27, Iraqi units began a chaotic retreat up Highway 80 toward Basra. Coalition aircraft pounded the fleeing columns, creating scenes of devastation that would be remembered as the Highway of Death, a grim tableau of burned-out vehicles, abandoned equipment, and dead soldiers that photographers captured in images that shocked the world. President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28, 1991 at 8 a.m. local time. Exactly 100 hours after the ground offensive began. Presidential statement, February 28, 1991. The war was over. Kuwait was liberated. And Iraq's coastal divisions, the 80,000 troops that had spent weeks watching the sea, had never fired a shot. Chapter 6. The Supporting Cast. The battleships and the Marines got the headlines, but the amphibious deception operation succeeded because of a much broader supporting effort, a complex web of real activities and fake signatures designed to overwhelm Iraqi intelligence analysts with contradictory information. One of the most remarkable elements was Task Force Troy, the unit that barely existed. Task Force Troy was officially designated as a Marine reconnaissance force, but its actual composition was tiny, approximately 100 Marine reservists. Various accounts range from 21 to 100 personnel, equipped with loudspeakers, dummy equipment, and a mission to create the illusion of a full Marine division preparing to attack Kuwait directly from the south. The task force operated along a 25-mile zone south of Al Wafra, near the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. Their arsenal included inflatable dummy tanks and artillery pieces, crude decoys that wouldn't fool aerial reconnaissance for long, but didn't need to. Iraqi analysts already believed the Marines were massing for an assault. The decoys simply reinforced that belief. More sophisticated were the audio signatures. Task Force Troy used loudspeakers to broadcast the sounds of tank engines, tracked vehicles, and radio chatter. Supply helicopters made regular flights to the position, creating the appearance of logistics activity, even though many flights delivered nothing. The deception worked. After the war, captured Iraqi officers confirmed they had expected the main Marine assault to come from Task Force Troy's position. Post-war intelligence debriefs documented in U.S. military studies. Iraqi artillery had been pre-registered on approaches from that area. Defensive positions were oriented to defend against that axis of attack. None of it was needed. The Marines attacked from entirely different positions. At sea, the deception extended beyond the battleships. The U.S. had assembled a genuine amphibious ready group: USS Tarawa, USS Tripoli, USS New Orleans, USS Vancouver, and numerous landing ships loaded with equipment and supplies. These vessels conducted realistic rehearsal operations, launched and recovered helicopters, and generally behaved exactly as an invasion fleet would behave. The amphibious group was a formidable force in its own right. USS Tarawa, the lead ship, displaced 39,000 tons and could carry an entire Marine battalion landing team, more than 1,900 Marines, along with their tanks, artillery, and supplies. Her well deck could launch LCU landing craft and AAV-7 amphibious assault vehicles. Her flight deck supported CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters and AV-8B Harrier jump jets. This was not a token presence. This was a genuine invasion capability being held in reserve. On February 25, while Missouri was under missile attack, Marine helicopters conducted a simulated landing operation targeting Failaka Island. The helicopters, carrying Light Attack Squadron 269, flew low over the island while Wisconsin's Pioneer reconnaissance drones circled overhead, transmitting video of Iraqi positions. USMC aviation records. The Pioneer drones represented a glimpse of warfare's future. Launched from a rail catapult mounted on the battleship's fantail, the small unmanned aircraft, wingspan 17 feet, weight 450 pounds, could orbit a target area for hours, transmitting real-time video back to the ship. The system had been developed in the 1980s as a low-cost reconnaissance platform, but its combat debut in Desert Storm revealed capabilities that would transform military operations in the decades ahead. Pioneer's cameras could observe Iraqi troop movements, identify targets for the battleship's guns, and assess damage after bombardment. The drones could loiter over targets that would be too dangerous for manned aircraft, operating in areas saturated with anti-aircraft fire. And because they were unmanned, their loss was inconvenient rather than tragic. No pilot to recover, no families to notify, just another expendable asset in the military inventory. The Pioneer drones created one of the war's more surreal moments. After witnessing Missouri's devastating bombardment of their positions on Failaka Island, Iraqi defenders attempted to surrender to the unmanned drones circling overhead, waving white flags and makeshift surrender banners, documented in multiple U.S. Navy sources. It was the first time in military history that soldiers tried to surrender to a robot. The incident highlighted the psychological impact of the deception operation. These Iraqi soldiers had endured weeks of bombardment, had watched their positions methodically, destroyed by weapons they couldn't see or counter, and had finally concluded that resistance was pointless. They were ready to surrender to anything, even a machine. The Navy's mine warfare operations, while genuinely necessary for force protection, also served the deception. Every minesweeping operation suggested preparation for an amphibious lane. Every mine destroyed indicated the invasion was coming. Iraqi intelligence could see the minesweepers working, USS Avenger, USS Leader, and British vessels HMS Ledbury and HMS Catastock, and draw the obvious conclusion. These operations were extraordinarily dangerous. The minesweepers operated in shallow water, moving slowly to allow their magnetic and acoustic sensors to detect buried mines. They were vulnerable to shore-based artillery, missile attack, and the mines they were trying to clear. The crews knew that a single mistake, a mine missed during the sweep, a navigation error that took them into an uncleared area, could be fatal. Even the casualties served the narrative. When Tripoli and Princeton struck mines on February 18th, the incidents made international news. From an Iraqi perspective, these were not accidents. They were evidence that the U.S. was willing to accept losses to clear a path for the invasion. Electronic warfare played a critical role. U.S. Navy EA-6B Prowler aircraft and Air Force EF-1-11 Ravens flew electronic attack missions designed to suppress Iraqi radar and communications. But these operations also had a secondary purpose: to create the electronic signature of an amphibious assault. Increased radio traffic, radar emissions, and jamming operations all suggested heightened activity offshore. Coalition deception specialists also exploited Iraqi paranoia. They knew that Iraq's intelligence service was intercepting radio communications, monitoring news broadcasts, and analyzing every scrap of information it could gather. So they fed the beast. Operational traffic related to the amphibious plans was deliberately transmitted over channels Iraqi signals intelligence could intercept. Planning documents were allowed to leak through lower classification networks. Press briefings mentioned the amphibious capability without explicitly stating it wouldn't be used. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. Iraqi intelligence saw 2 battleships bombarding the coast, an amphibious ready group maneuvering offshore, Marine helicopters conducting reconnaissance, mine warfare operations clearing approach lanes, Task Force Troy creating the illusion of a division-strength force, electronic warfare activity consistent with invasion preparation, media coverage emphasizing the Marines' capability. Every indicator pointed toward amphibious assault, and crucially, none of it was false. The ships were real, the bombardment was real, the Marines were real. The only deception was in the intent. The coalition had the capability to execute an amphibious assault, had planned for it in detail, but had ultimately decided it wasn't necessary. This distinction mattered. Deception operations that rely on fabricated evidence tend to collapse when adversaries investigate closely. But this operation relied on genuine capabilities displayed in misleading ways. Iraqi analysts could verify every fact they observed. The ships existed, the Marines were embarked, the equipment was real, and still reached the wrong conclusion about coalition intentions. Chapter 7. The Scoreboard. The final accounting of the amphibious deception operation requires measuring success not by what happened, but by what didn't happen. The U.S. Marines never landed on a hostile beach in Kuwait. No amphibious assault was executed. 0 Marines died storming coastal defenses. This absence is the clearest measure of the operation's success. Intelligence assessments conducted after the war, based on captured Iraqi documents, interrogations of Iraqi officers, and coalition reconnaissance, concluded that approximately 80,000 Iraqi troops remained deployed in defensive positions along the Kuwaiti coast throughout the ground offensive. U.S. Army War College Study, Deception in Desert Storm. These forces included at least 6 infantry divisions, the 2nd, 11th, 18th, 19th, and 2 additional formations, plus mechanized reserves. British Joint Intelligence Committee assessment. 80,000 troops is not a token force. It represented nearly 20% of Iraq's total military deployment in the Kuwait theater of operations. These divisions had artillery, armor, prepared positions, and supply lines. They were combat-capable units that, if redeployed to counter the coalition's western attack, could have inflicted significantly higher casualties on advancing U.S. and British forces. The Battle of Khafji in late January 1991 had demonstrated what happened when Iraqi forces launched coordinated offensive operations. Iraqi mechanized units had briefly seized the Saudi coastal town of Khafji, and it required intense fighting, including Marine artillery, close air support, and battleship gunfire from USS Missouri, to dislodge them. Official U.S. Missouri. Marine Corps combat history. The battle cost 18 U.S. killed in action, most from a friendly fire incident. If those 6 coastal divisions had been available to reinforce Iraqi positions in western Kuwait during the ground offensive, American casualties would have been higher. How much higher is impossible to calculate precisely, but military analysts consistently emphasize that the deception operation's value lay in preventing Iraqi forces from concentrating where they could do the most harm. There is also the question of what didn't happen at sea. The Silkworm attack on February 25 was one of only 2 instances where Iraqi coastal defense missiles engaged U.S. ships during the war. Iraq's missile arsenal included dozens of Silkworm launchers and substantial stockpiles of ammunition. If Iraqi command had recognized the amphibious threat as a deception, they could have conserved these weapons for use against other targets, supply ships, minesweepers, or even aircraft carriers. Instead, they fired at the battleships, depleting their missile inventory to counter a threat that never materialized. The missiles destroyed in retaliatory airstrikes were missiles that couldn't threaten real coalition operations. The speed of the ground offensive, 100 hours from start to ceasefire, was itself partly a product of the deception operation's success. When coalition forces punched through the Saddam line and wheeled east toward Kuwait, they found Iraqi defensive positions oriented to defend against attacks from the wrong directions. Artillery was aimed at the coast. Reserves were positioned to counter amphibious landings. Intelligence officers had briefed their commanders to expect Marines from the sea. By the time Iraqi command recognized what was happening, it was too late to reposition. Coalition air superiority meant that any Iraqi unit that tried to move in daylight was destroyed by air attack. Units that tried to move at night got lost in the desert or bogged down in traffic jams. The Republican Guard divisions that did attempt to counter the coalition advance were caught in the open and decimated in battles like 73 Easting and Norfolk. There were costs. USS Tripoli and USS Princeton both struck mines during deception operations. Tripoli suffered a large hole blown in her bow but remained afloat. Princeton sustained more serious damage. The Manta mine's explosion broke frames, flooded compartments, and injured 3 sailors. U.S. Cross. Navy damage assessment reports. Both ships would require months of repairs. USS Missouri and her escorts operated under genuine threat throughout February. The Silkworm missile that HMS Gloucester destroyed came within 15 miles of hitting the battleship. A hit would not necessarily have sunk Missouri. Her armor was formidable, but it could have caused casualties and might have forced her withdrawal from operations, undermining the deception at a critical moment. The risks extended beyond physical damage. If any of the amphibious demonstration operations had gone wrong, if helicopters had been shot down, if a battleship had struck a mine and capsized, if Iraqi special forces had successfully attacked the amphibious ships, the deception could have backfired spectacularly. A failed demonstration might have revealed the operation's true nature and allowed Iraqi forces to redeploy. But these risks were acceptable, because the alternative, a frontal assault against well-defended positions, or a genuine amphibious landing under fire, carried far higher costs. The Vietnam War had demonstrated that the American public would not tolerate high casualties in limited wars. Desert Storm's decisive, low-casualty victory helped restore American confidence in military operations after 2 decades of post-Vietnam skepticism. The battleships themselves never returned to combat. Both Missouri and Wisconsin were decommissioned in 1992, victims of post-Cold War budget cuts and the simple reality that naval warfare had moved beyond the age of armored gun platforms. Missouri is now a museum ship at Pearl Harbor, moored near the USS Arizona Memorial. Wisconsin is a museum in Norfolk, Virginia. Both ships sit as monuments to an era when naval power was measured in tons of steel and the range of heavy guns. Their final combat deployment in Desert Storm demonstrated both their enduring value and their obsolescence. The 16-inch guns provided firepower unmatched by any other platform. A single battleship could deliver more ordnance on a target in 1 hour than multiple squadrons of aircraft. The armor protection allowed them to operate in threat environments that would have been prohibitively dangerous for modern surface combatants. But these advantages came at enormous cost in crew, fuel, and maintenance. In an era of precision-guided munitions, satellite reconnaissance, and stealth technology, the battleships represented a different philosophy of warfare. The deception operation itself entered military doctrine as a case study in operational art. U.S. military academies and staff colleges still teach Desert Storm as an example of how to integrate multiple forms of deception, strategic, operational, and tactical, into a coherent plan. The operation demonstrated several enduring principles. First, effective deception exploits enemy assumptions rather than creating entirely false narratives. Iraqi commanders believed an amphibious assault was possible because it was possible. The coalition didn't have to fabricate capability. They simply had to display existing capability in ways that suggested intent. This made the deception more durable because every element Iraqi intelligence investigated led to confirmation of what they already believed. Second, successful deception requires accepting real risk. The battleships operating in minefields, the helicopters flying reconnaissance over defended islands, the minesweepers clearing approach lanes. All of these activities carried genuine danger, but the willingness to accept that risk made the deception credible. If the Navy had conducted the entire operation from safe standoff distances, Iraqi intelligence would have recognized it as theater. Third, deception works best when integrated with kinetic operations. The Missouri's gunfire support wasn't just for show. Those shells destroyed real Iraqi positions, degraded combat effectiveness, and contributed to the overall air and artillery campaign that preceded the ground offensive. The deception operation served multiple purposes simultaneously. It fixed Iraqi forces in place, it degraded Iraqi capabilities through direct fire, and it provided valuable intelligence on Iraqi defensive positions and responses. Fourth, modern warfare requires deception at multiple echelons simultaneously. While the Navy conducted the amphibious deception at the operational level, ground forces like Task Force Troy executed tactical deceptions. Coalition electronic warfare units conducted technical deceptions, creating false radio networks and jamming Iraqi communications. Media operations, press briefings emphasizing marine capabilities, news coverage of amphibious exercises, contributed to strategic deception by shaping international and Iraqi perceptions. The lessons extended beyond deception into the broader conduct of modern war. Desert Storm demonstrated that technological superiority in night vision, precision weapons, and communications could create decisive advantages even against numerically superior forces. The 100-hour ground war obscured months of planning, rehearsal, and positioning. The easy victory created expectations, some justified, some not, about American military capability that would shape conflicts for decades. But Desert Storm also revealed limitations. The coalition's intelligence picture was incomplete. The mine threat was underestimated. Iraqi defensive positions were not fully mapped, and estimates of enemy strength proved inflated. The air campaign, while devastating, failed to destroy Iraqi mobile Scud launchers despite intensive effort. And the decision to halt the ground offensive after 100 hours, while politically and strategically sound, allowed substantial Iraqi forces to escape destruction. The amphibious deception operation succeeded because it exploited a specific set of circumstances. An enemy with limited reconnaissance capability, defending a position with obvious vulnerability to amphibious assault, against a coalition with overwhelming air superiority and genuine amphibious capability. Replicating that success against a more sophisticated adversary, one with satellite reconnaissance, global signals intelligence, and cyber capabilities, would be significantly more difficult. The final irony of the amphibious deception operation is that it worked so well that it nearly prevented the ground offensive from happening at all. On February 22, President Bush, under pressure from Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev to give Iraq one more diplomatic opportunity to withdraw, ordered a brief pause before the ground attack. During those crucial hours, Iraqi command could have recognized the Western movement of coalition forces and redeployed. They didn't. The coastal divisions stayed in place, watching the sea, waiting for an invasion that never came. Their commanders were not stupid, and their intelligence officers were not incompetent. They made rational decisions based on the information available to them. That information was accurate in every detail. The battleships were real, the Marines were ready, the bombardment was devastating. The only thing that was false was the underlying intent, and by the time that became clear, the war was over. 100 hours later, the war was over.